everyone, and welcome to this episode of That Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts, Will and Jacob.
Hello.
So, today, Jacob, we are going to be talking about popular drinks. But how popular? Well, we're not going to be talking about tap water today, but what we're talking about is not far off, actually, in terms of popularity. We are talking about the world's second most popular drink today. Can you guess what that is?
Is it something that could be made with tap water?
Yes. I suppose so.
Hot drink or cold?
Hot drink. Or cold.
Trick question.
We're of course talking about tea this episode. Tea, which it never really clicked to me until I read this article, actually. And I don't know whether that's embarrassing or just, one of those things. Tea is the name of the drink produced by heating with water the leaves of a particular plant. The plant being Camellia sinensis. And that's what tea is. There are obviously other drinks called herbal teas, which refers to drinks that are made with essentially anything else, any other leaf that isn't from this particular species. But tea is this species put in water. And I just found that interesting because I'd never really thought about it like that. I don't expect you to have had the same experience there, but what do you think of tea?
Well, I'm now questioning the next time I make anything, food or drink, when I'll take a step back and look at the ingredients that I'm using and say, this is actually it's a vegetable, it's a plant. Where is the plant coming from? Who sold it to me? How was it created? How has it been cultivated to be different from its natural form? And the same goes for drinks. Tea is actually not something I partake in that often. I'm ashamed to admit, despite being English, and of course in English culture, tea is the most important beverage, I would argue, followed closely perhaps by beer. It's unusual to not be a tea drinker.
May I interject to say that this is, as far as I know, a factually based statement. For a survey from 2017, found 63% of people in the United Kingdom drink tea every day.
Yes, and that's every day. So imagine people who drink tea at all. What percentage does that go up to in the UK, right?
I drink it many days, but I don't drink it every day. So I'm not in that majority.
I know very few people who don't drink tea at all. I mean, I'm not averse to it, but I actually prefer more sort of green teas or herbal teas from other Camellia plants, sort of Chinese style infusions, which I don't have very often. So the standard British tea, sometimes called, I guess, white tea, which is a bit confusing because there is a way of preparing tea leaves that leads to a different kind of white tea. Is something that I don't enjoy it. I don't really enjoy the milky, like milk and hot water, and there's no flavour to it for me. So I'm a bit maybe controversial in that sense. So I found it interesting going through the article and feeling vindicated about all the other kinds of teas that not only exist but are extremely popular around the world. And I now feel confident in declaring that the British way of preparing and drinking tea is not, by any account, the dominant or preferred method worldwide. I think English tea culture is weird, and it's the plant is a Chinese or also from Myanmar as well, maybe, but certainly majority a Chinese plant originally, and I would say that the Chinese culture has the best way of preparing and drinking tea. That's my 2 cents on this particular beverage.
Well, I'll ask you about that in a second, but I just want to alert any listeners that I have a cup of tea in front of me right now, just for research purposes, of course. But this is not my my normal cup of tea. I've decided to prepare it without milk or sugar, and I've brewed it for a shorter amount of time so that I can actually handle the flavour. Because, of course, most tea in the UK is black tea. So if you leave the tea bag in the water for a couple of minutes, you get a very dark brown colour. But, of course, there's lots of different variants of tea, and black tea is simply the most oxidised form, I believe.
Yes.
So I can leave a review of this tea right now. I'm drinking Yorkshire tea. I'm in Yorkshire drinking Yorkshire tea. So, and fun Yorkshire fact: the tea bag, the first tea bag to be sold within the UK, the first business to do tea bags was Tetley's, and that was out of Yorkshire as well. So Yorkshire is a bit of a tea capital within the UK.
Ooh, controversial statement there, because I am on the other side of the country, down in the southwest, where we have 2 competitive counties, Devon and Cornwall, and they would claim, the locals, that actually it is the southwestern English cream teas that is more quintessential to a tea room environment, where you'd have maybe a scone with some jam and some clotted cream and tea served with it. To me, I mean, I'm not from the southwest or Yorkshire. I'm from the southeast, but to me that sounds a bit more appealing. You know, that environment, a bit more kind of full. You know, with some food to pad out and fill up the corners.
I don't think those in Yorkshire are barring you from having a snack with your tea.
Fair enough. Okay, so interesting that we say black tea, because in the original Mandarin, what we would call black tea in Chinese is actually called red tea, hong cha, and what the Chinese call black tea, hei cha, is actually what we would call dark tea or post-fermented tea, which is unwilted and unoxidized tea that has then been allowed to actually fully ferment and compost. In addition to those 2 stronger teas, you can intervene at any process after tea leaf cuttings to create different called colours of tea. Although if you add milk to black tea in Western countries, it would be called white tea often. Technically, white tea is actually tea prepared from leaves that are wilted and unoxidized. Yellow tea is when you don't allow the leaves to wilt, let them yellow instead. And if you don't let them yellow, they stay green, so the tea from that is called green tea. And finally, breaking with convention of naming things after colours, oolong tea is where you allow oxidization to partially occur after leaf cutting. And the reason why the leaves change colour is because once you start cutting up the plant, it starts to decay, and the oxidization processes that the enzymes trigger release tannins into the plant, which darkens it over time. So the darker your tea is, in theory, the stronger it will be. Yet another reason why I don't see the need to add milk to black tea. Like, it should be pretty strong by itself. Something that I found interesting when researching tea is that the plant, as you mentioned, Camellia sinensis, is not classified under the IUCN's conservation status system. We mentioned it back in the platypus episode, but it's data deficient, which is strange considering there are tea plantations all around the world. 7 million tons of tea are produced each year, which would suggest to me that the planet is not in danger of this particular plant going extinct, but perhaps it's referring to the natural wild tea plant. But I'm not sure. I just found that a curious observation in my research. Did you find anything that you found particularly engaging or eyebrow raising?
I suppose as an Englishman, I was interested to note the section on Ireland for Ireland's tea culture. So Ireland, as of 2016, was the second biggest per capita consumer of tea in the world. Although, what's the top actually? Let me open that link. Because if it's no, it's not. So Ireland has a greater per capita tea consumption than the UK. So Turkey, actually, the Turks are the greatest tea consumers, followed by the Irish, followed by the British, and then the Russians. So that was interesting to me. Local blends are the most popular in Ireland, but they also use Rwandan, Kenyan, and Assam teas in their Irish breakfast tea, which was interesting to me. So there's some African ingredients in their tea, but specifically from African countries that were once affiliated with Britain, you could say, more closely. So this all ties in with, interestingly, it all ties in with somewhat with the East India Company.
Yes.
Does it not?
It does. I was about to say this. A second callback. Tea is the great unifier of the podcast, apparently. And it has... I have kind of two simultaneous prongs of thought here. Firstly, this is a good opportunity for people all around the world, wherever you're listening from, to experience some cultural shocks. Because, for example, if you're American, the article claims that tea in the United States is most commonly taken iced, maybe with a slice of lemon, certainly with ice cubes. It's a cold drink, refreshing on a hot day. Whereas in the UK, although we do have iced teas available at shops and stuff, by default, if you would offer someone tea, you would expect it to be hot with the options of milk and sugar. You mentioned Turkey there being the, on a per capita basis, the greatest country in the world for tea consumption. But Turkey is often associated with its coffee production. And yet the Turkish themselves, so it seems, prefer tea. Also, tea has been responsible, looping back to the East India Company, partially, for at least 2 wars. I say one sincerely, one a bit facetiously. Sincerely, the restriction of the tea trade by the Kangxi Chinese emperor led to the Opium Wars, as the British felt that they had to address their trade deficit because of high taxes on anything being exported from China at the time. And closer to home, perhaps, the Tea Act of 1773 provoked. Yeah, I'm hesitant to say directly, but at least partially, and it was the spark that provoked the Boston Tea Party, which is one of the biggest precursor events to the American Revolution, or the American War of Independence, depending on which side of history you're landing on. So it's fascinating to me that a plant has been kind of responsible for this in a roundabout sort of way. Not that it's absolving responsibility for any of that aforementioned violence, of course, but the idea that this humble tree, because it is a tree, if you don't cultivate tea in plantations, but instead allow it to grow naturally, it will grow into a tree, has been responsible for 2 major wars, world-changing events, and a cultural obsession that has lasted the better part of 400 years in the UK. So, what would be your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's interesting, but it makes a lot of sense to me. It seems actually fairly intuitive. Wars are fought over. Well, they might seem nowadays to be fought over things that just simply don't make any sense. But in the large part, wars are related to resources, and tea is a resource. Resources can be plants, and then if you take a step back from that, if we're looking historically in particular, in the earlier days of agriculture before the agricultural revolution, then we're looking at terrain and climate being hugely important in where certain things can grow, the abundance of essential or highly commodified resources. So I don't know. It's one of those things,
I guess. But at the same time, I mean, tea isn't an essential resource that a country must have to flourish in the same sense that oil is, or maybe going back, 2,000 years, things like iron, copper, mineral deposits. I understand it's a source of wealth, but it still stands out to me as unique, perhaps, in being such a pivotal trading commodity, despite essentially not being inherently valuable beyond people enjoy extracting the leaves, crushing them, and drinking them.
I suppose it's more along the lines of jewelry or something like that.
Yeah,
In the sense, I mean, speaking of, there's not even any real discernible health benefit to tea. So it is essentially you put more work and more money into something that has a similar nutritional benefit to drinking water. So it is, in that respect, I can see, I understand more your line of thinking that is definitely different to some of these other resources. Like, it makes more sense that people would fight over land that they can grow wheat on because they need the wheat to make the bread so that they can survive. But tea is different. Tea is part of a grander economic reality that drives people to produce things and to do work. And in that sense, it is a commodity worth fighting for.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm kind of obligated to, right, being English. I found it interesting as well. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, as I normally do with these Wikipedia articles. They're fractal. You can just click on the first thing or just keep going forever. In that tea, the drink, and the plant has nothing to do with the oil, tea tree oil. I didn't know this. I mean, I wasn't necessarily assuming that they were related to each other, but tea tree oil is an essential oil. Essential here being code for essence or fragrance, essence of the plant, as opposed to being vital for life or anything, and is used in kind of perfumes and fragrances. But it grows from is harvested from a completely different plant that is endemic to southeast Queensland in Australia and has absolutely nothing to do with tea, the drink. So that seems to just be an etymological coincidence and a very confusing one as well. Also,
interesting. I don't think I'd ever actually considered that before, as I obviously hadn't considered what plants are actually used to make tea. I'd also not considered what's used to make tea tree oil. But thank you for raising that one.
Well, there you go.
And please continue. You were going to say something else.
Well, my second tidbit that the article mentions a bit offhandedly, but I think could be worth exploring further for anyone who's interested. There is evidence to suggest that tea was originally used as either a medicine or a food, rather than a source of flavour to be infused into a water-based beverage. It has been used throughout China for literally thousands of years. Its first recorded instance was in 59 BC, though it almost certainly originated earlier than that. And evidence suggests that the leaves and components of the Camellia sinensis plant were harvested, crushed, but not immediately put into boiling water, but either eaten directly or used in salves, balms, that sort of thing. And that links back to what you were saying about the commonly held belief, I must say, that tea is a naturally sourced medicine. But there's no scientific evidence for that, really, is there?
No, so what I could think of, well, I say I think of, I've just read the article, so I'm not sure I can claim credit for any thoughts that are written down on the page. But it does make sense due to the fact, if you think about in its dry weight, I believe, tea is about 3% caffeine, and although larger doses of caffeine do have a measurable impact on health, short and long term, in much smaller doses like you get in tea, I can envisage there being a short-term effect with no measurable long-term effect. So it might be the case that if you drink tea, you do feel a little more revitalized, and I wouldn't be surprised if that does come up in the literature, because that wouldn't necessarily fall under this statement here about tea affecting diseases or improving health, as it would be more of a short-term drug effect. And the other thing is, tea contains a few other interesting chemicals, including, for one, a drug called theophylline, which is actually used to treat respiratory diseases. Did you know that?
I didn't. I read, obviously, the paragraphs on chemical composition, but I didn't follow up any of the hyperlinked chemicals. I just assumed they were insignificant.
Interesting. So theophylline itself is used to dilate your airways, basically. So it's used in asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's also used to increase blood flow. So has a few effects. Although the question is, does tea contain enough of these drugs to actually have any pharmacological, physiological effect on the body? And that, I'm not really sure.
Well,
it might be.
I mean, for comparison, one study found that the caffeine content of 1 gram of black tea ranged from, say, 22 to 28, so about 25 micrograms or milligrams, while the caffeine content of weaker teas contain is less. So that's the base mark for sort of worthy of note in numbers that the article uses. So when in the next sentence it says it contains small amounts of other chemicals, including theophylline, I would assume it's under 10 milligrams per gram. But maybe that's enough to be significant. My knowledge of chemistry is limited, so I wouldn't know.
Well, unfortunately, I'm just in the process of logging in with my university login to have access to the paper that there's the reference for that. Oh, interesting. Well, the title of the article is Green Tea Composition. So I don't know whether that differs from the tea in the tea bags that I get from the shops as well. So who knows? But the thing to bear in mind, I think this is where I'm a bit of a pedant, is in the technical language, which again, it's possible on something like Wikipedia that sentences are written in a slightly misleading or incorrect way. But when it comes to questions of medical science, as you could argue, the question of is tea good for your health would be, then probably you would look at that question as like a long-term thing, like does long-term tea consumption reduce your risk of certain diseases, improve your life expectancy or anything like that, whereas any short-term impacts of tea, like making you feel more energized in the 5 minutes or an hour after you drink it, wouldn't necessarily have a substantial impact on your long-term health, but would still be interesting to know.
Maybe
and relevant.
I mean, maybe the more discerning question for the average tea drinker is not so much whether it's good for your health, but whether it's bad for your health. And because it's mostly water, has been consumed for many thousands of years, and I don't recall reading anything in the summary article on Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge, that says it's been linked to cancers or other pathogens, cancers or pathogens or anything. I would conclude it's not bad for your health, and so if you like tea, continue to drink it in as copious quantities as you desire, because I think it will be fine.
I'll just flag up here, Botanical Online lists a few contraindications to tea.
Whoa.
Again, linked to the caffeine. So they say that tea is not recommended in the case of symptoms such as nervous or cardiac disorders, palpitations, epilepsy, arrhythmia, heart failure, insomnia, nervousness. So I imagine there are some scenarios where you wouldn't really want to drink caffeine, but aside from that, I think a moderate amount of caffeine is fine for most people.
Caffeine is a wonder drug. That's really the key message that I need to communicate.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we are more or less out of time, but thank you for joining us on this exploration of tea, a plant that has forced its way into everything from your kitchen cupboard to major international conflicts. So the next time you're brewing yourself a cup of tea, appreciate it.
And consider telling us how you like your tea and why in the comments.
Thank you.